Ottawa has a word for spending $78 billion it doesn't have investment. And whether you already own a home in this country or you're still clawing your way towards one, that single word is now sitting on your family's tab because Mark Carney's first budget booked the largest deficit in the history of this country that a pandemic didn't cause. Not the biggest Justin Trudeau ever ran. Bigger than that, the man sold to us as the sober central banker, the guy who'd finally bring the grown-ups back to the nation's books, tabled a plan last fall with $78.3 billion of red ink on the front page, close to double what the previous government had penciled in for this very year. Canada's own independent budget watchdog rated and reached for a word he told a common committee he had not needed in 30 years on the job. And the reason he reached for it is not the headline number. Keep that in your back pocket because here is what should stop anyone with kids and a mortgage renewal on the calendar cold. The smaller, friendlier figure the government showed you this spring was not the reassurance it looked like. It came in lower. That is precisely why almost nobody is walking you through the harder math underneath it. Start with the story Carney told you about that number, because on its face is a reasonable one. His argument runs like this. There are two kinds of government spending. There is day-to-day money, the operating side, salaries and benefits and program checks. And he promised to balance that within 3 years. Then there is capital, the nation-building side, housing and defense and infrastructure. And borrowing to build things that last, he said, is not the same as borrowing to keep the lights on. If you run a household, that logic even tracks. A mortgage on a house you will live in for 30 years is a different animal than putting this week's groceries on a credit card. Ottawa borrowed to build the pitch went not to survive. A supporter could not belong to every word of it. Then the Parliamentary Budget Officer opened the books. That office is not a conservative war room. It is the nonpartisan referee Parliament created to check the government's math, and the interim officer Jason Jack found that the government's own definition of capital investments was, in his words, overly expansive. How expansive? By his count, Ottawa had filed roughly $94 billion under capital investment that did not belong there. Things like investment tax credits, subsidies, and corporate tax breaks, ordinary operating spending wearing a national building costume. Quote, the way the government went about this certainly was not transparent. End quote. That is the referee talking, not the opposition. In plain speech, a large chunk of the money Carney called building was spending with a better name stapled to, which means the whole promise to balance the day-to-day books depends on a line the watchdog says was drawn in the wrong place. On his math, that balance slips a full year past what the budget claims. Now watch what happened when someone tried to pin the timing down. At the Commons Finance Committee, a Conservative MP named Pat Kelly asked the finance minister a genuinely simple question. What year will the budget be balanced? Francois-Philippe Champagne answered with a few dozen words that were not an answer. Kelly asked again. Then again, the exchange dissolved into a debate about what the word balanced even means. When the person holding the country's checkbook cannot name the year, that tells you something the glossy pages will not. And the budget officer's rid on the government hitting its own targets was blunt. He put the odds at 7 and 12 per 7.5. But the relabeling is the small con here. The number sitting underneath it is the one the watchdog could not stop talking about. Weeks before the budget existed, before anyone had seen a single figure, Jason Jack went in front of a parliamentary committee and did something budget officers almost never do. He sounded an alarm about a document that hadn't been written yet. Canada's finances, he said, were at the precipice. He called the trajectory shocking, stupefying, not sustainable. Reporters asked what going over the precipice would actually look like, and he would only say nothing good. He could file that under a watchdog being theoretical before a big fiscal event. That is certainly how the government treated it. The finance minister shrugged that the budget officer can have his own view, but the shrug was covering something. Everyone had assumed the coming deficit was a one-time hit. Trump's tariffs had punched a hole in the economy, revenue was down, and a single rough year is the kind of thing a country absorbs and moves past. That was the comforting version. Then the budget landed, and this was not a one-year spike. $78.3 billion for this fiscal year alone. Let me put that number where it belongs. The largest non-pandemic deficit any Canadian government had ever run was Justin Trudeau's $61.9 billion. And people called that a scandal at the time. Carney's first budget did not nudge past it. It cleared it by more than $16 billion. Take the co-years off the table entirely, and you have to go back to the 2009 global financial meltdown to find anything in the same country. I had to read that comparison twice myself. The banker broke the record, and he broke it without a recession to blame. And it does not fade. That is what turns a bad year into a bad decade. The deficit is still projected above $56 billion in 2029 and 2030. Stack the years and the plane piles on better than $300 billion in new debt by the end of the decade. This budget marked the 10th year running that Ottawa did not balance its books, and the measure economists actually watched the debt growing faster than the whole economy. Jacques told that committee was rising over time for the first time in 30 years of him doing his work. The Liberals had campaigned on holding the exact line. The budget quietly let go. Then the market returned its own verdict. And this part cannot be spun into a talking point. 2 weeks after the budget, Fitch, one of the big three rating agencies, stripped Canada of its top-tier AAA. The reason it put in writing, quote, persistent fiscal expansion and a rising debt burden, end quote. That is not a pundit with an axe to grind. That is the cost of Canada's borrowing going up on the record. So what does a downgrade plus a record deficit actually do to the money in your own account? That is the arithmetic Ottawa would rather you never sit down and run, so let's run it. So put the two halves together. On one side, spending relabeled as investment, so the books rebalanced on the other, a record deficit the country is not going to grow its way out of. Set them beside each other and they stop being two stories. They are one move run more than once, and it has a shape. Call it rebranding the debt. Here is how the play works, and every step off it is on the public record. Step 1, take ordinary spending and file it under capital investments, roughly $94 billion of it. So the operating budget can be called balanced. Step 2, quietly retire the debt to GDP anchor you campaigned on keeping, and when anyone asks about it, change the subject to the G7. Step 3, forecast a frightening deficit, then announce a smaller one and present the difference as discipline. That third step is not hypothetical. The spring update is where it happened. The $78 billion came in at $66.9 billion on stronger than expected revenue, and the government took a victory lap. I want to be fair here because this part is real. The number did come in lower, but lower than a scary forecast is not the same as under control. And here is the detail nobody printed on the poster. $66.9 billion is still the largest non-pandemic deficit in the history of the country. They beat their own forecast and broke the record anyway. That is not a turnaround. That is a slower way to lose. And you do not have to take my word for any of this, which is the entire point of this channel. The government has a genuinely strong line, and I'll give it to you straight. Canada still carries the lowest deficit and the lowest debt in the G7, and it still holds a AAA from two of the three big agencies. A former budget officer looked at the same books and called them sustainable. The current one called them a precipice. Two credible people, opposite reads, every report a search anyway. Decide for yourself. Where it lands on your kitchen table, though, is not a matter of opinion. Ottawa now spends more servicing its debt than it sends the provinces for healthcare. More on interest than on hospitals. That interest bill is headed toward $81 billion by the end of the decade. And that is money that can never build a road or treat a single patient. Run it down to your level. Every baby born in this country this year arrives owing more than $33,000 in federal debt. I've got two of them asleep down the hall. And a downgrade like the one Fitch just handed us does not stay politely in Ottawa. Higher borrowing costs for the country seep into the rates underneath everything. The same way a ding to your own credit score follows you straight into your next mortgage renewal. Go pull your renewal letter. Look at which way rates are moving and ask yourself whether calling the grocery bill an investment would ever bring that number down for you. Which raises the one question the whole cheerful spring rollout was built to keep you from asking. The question is a plain one. If a record deficit that you relabeled cannot outgrow and had your credit rating cut over is what winning looks like in Ottawa, then what on earth does losing look like? Here is what the documented record actually says underneath all the branding. This was not one hard year forced on us by a trade war, though the trade war was real enough. It was the 10th straight year without a balanced budget, a fiscal anchor the government promised to keep and then dropped, a top-tier credit rating gone, and a nonpartisan watchdog reaching for language he had not needed in 30 years. Read that together. Those are not the marks of a single rough budget. They are the marks of a chosen direction. And remember the word we opened on, the one Ottawa uses for spending money it does not have, investment. That is the whole trick in a single syllable. The polish laid over the friendlier number they showed you this spring and hoped you would stop reading after. You do not have to believe this country is broke to believe that a problem is worth saying out loud. I do not think it's broke. I think it's being run by people who decided the answer to a debt they cannot explain is a nicer word for it. So here's the figure they buried under all of it, and it is the one to carry out of here. The largest deficit in the history of this country that a pandemic did not cause, and they called it discipline.